Canada is not worth it for me to invest a single cent in it. This phrase sounded cold, like the strike of a knife piercing the air, causing the crowded International Hall in Toronto to plunge into a suffocating silence. All the camera flashes, which had just been sparkling without stopping, instantly went out. Lenses froze halfway, as if the photographers themselves had turned to stone from amazement. The man who threw out this phrase was none other than Crown Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, a man from the royal dynasty of the Gulf states, known to the whole world for his colossal fortune and arrogant statements. In his incomplete 40 years, Abdulaziz had already inherited and managed a powerful investment fund that invested billions of dollars in European technology corporations and once bought an entire transport company overnight. The Western press called him the hawk of risky deals. But today he stepped onto Canadian soil for the first time, which was extolled as a new direction for global capital, and at the very least, promises or an honest assessment were expected from him. Instead of a classic suit like other investors, Abdulaziz appeared in a long white robe the color of ivory, with his head covered by a red and white keffiyeh, held in place by a shiny black agal, the canonical style of an Arab crown prince. His steps echoed evenly on the carpeted path, radiating authority and coldness, which had become his personal brand. And so from behind the microphones, his husky, low and confident voice dropped every word. Not worth it. Not a single cent. The whole hall was stunned. In the front row, someone jumped up. The simultaneous interpreters stumbled, their eyes expressing confusion. Journalists looked at each other, fountain pens hovering over the clean pages of notebooks. And just a few minutes later, dense rows of angry comments appeared on Canadian social networks with a hashtag spreading like a wildfire in the dry brush. This phrase flew apart with the speed of a hurricane, turning a speech less than a minute long into the main news of the day. In the heavy atmosphere, Abdulaziz continued to stand, his hands firmly resting on the wooden podium, his gaze icy. It was as if he was stating an obvious fact, not caring that the whole hall froze in indignation and disbelief. The hall had not yet had time to recover from the shock when a strange sound was heard, a quiet crackling, similar to the sound of a burning wire. At first, only a few heard it, but immediately after that, a bright flash illuminated the corner of the huge LED screen behind the podium. A thin stream of gray smoke crawled upward, as if pushed by an invisible hand. "Short circuit!" one of the technicians screamed in panic. This scream became a spark thrown into a haystack of dry hay. Hundreds of people jumped from their seats. Wooden chairs fell with a crash. Someone pushed a stand with cameras hard, making a dull thud. The smoke suddenly became thick, spreading quickly. The acrid smell of burnt plastic penetrated every breath, and then the fire siren wailed, tearing apart the space like the whistling of the wind. People pushing rushed to the emergency exits, screams calling names, the chaotic clatter of high heels on the floor. An elderly man fell, knocked down by the crowd. He tried to lean on his hands to get up, but the smoke became thicker, obscuring even the light of the ceiling lamps. In this chaos, Abdulaziz stood motionless, choking on a cough, his eyes burning from the smoke. Omar, his faithful bodyguard, immediately wrapped his arms around him, protecting him, and dragged him away from the podium. Sarah, his advisor, said in a trembling voice, "We need to get out immediately, Your Highness." But the panicking crowd blocked the aisles. The side door on the left was tightly jammed by the rushing people. The door on the right was hidden in thick smoke. Abdulaziz tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs were scorched. A fit of coughing shook his body. He staggered. His legs suddenly became leaden. He bent low, covering his nose, and followed the bodyguard. A strong and clear female voice sounded through the surrounding screams. In the murky haze, a figure rushed toward them. A woman in a dark blue paramedic uniform. In her hand she held a white cloth, with which she hastily wrapped the nose and mouth of a little boy who had lost consciousness. Putting the child in a safe place, she turned around and walked quickly toward the crowd. Her bright eyes glided over every panicking face. "Man in black, keep that door open. Girl in red, lead people forward. Don't push, walk slowly, keep low." Her voice did not tremble. Every order sounded clear like a drum roll. Abdulaziz sank onto the edge of the podium, coughing heavily, his vision blurred by the smoke. He saw someone crouch down beside him. It was the very girl who had just been giving orders. She knelt on one knee, applied a wet cloth to his hand, pressed it to his mouth, holding it firmly. "Breathe through this, slowly." Omar tried to lead Abdulaziz away, but she stopped him. Her voice was hurried but decisive. "If he stands up now, he will lose consciousness right at the door. I will get him out." Not waiting for an answer, she slipped her strong arm under Abdulaziz's shoulder, nodded to Omar. "Follow me. Cover from behind." Abdulaziz almost didn't have time to react. His legs were trembling, but her support made his steps more confident. The whole group, pressing against the wall, moved toward the exit. Thick smoke enveloped them. The smell of burnt plastic mixed with the smell of metal was nauseating. A small explosion rang out from behind. A reddish flash in the smoke forced the whole hall to scream in unison. Abdulaziz felt his heart clench, but the female voice sounded again right at his ear, hard as steel. "Keep walking! Don't stop! Breathe slowly!" The emergency exit door flew open. A cold stream of air from the corridor burst inside like a knife, cutting off the smell of smoke. Abdulaziz was led outside. The back of his shirt was wet with sweat. The girl sat him down on the steps, quickly checked his pupils, and only then turned to save others. Only when her hand left his shoulder did Abdulaziz realize that he had just been pulled out of the inferno between life and death by a Canadian person whom he had humiliated with a contemptuous phrase just a few minutes ago. He raised his head, following her small but determined figure, his heart pounding, and his own cold words spoken a few minutes ago echoed in his head. "Canada is not worth it for me to invest a single cent in it." Now, in the very place he had just despised, a hand was found that saved him without asking who he was. The alarm siren fell silent, leaving only footsteps and scraps of conversations. The luxurious hotel lobby had turned into an improvised rescue point. Armchairs and sofas were pushed together to seat those who had inhaled smoke. A cocktail table covered with a white tablecloth became a place for oxygen tanks. Bottles of water and wet towels piled up on the reception desk. Suits and evening dresses, which had recently sparkled, were now covered with a layer of soot. Abdulaziz leaned against a marble column, the wet cloth still covering his mouth. Every breath burned his lungs as if sand had gotten into them. Omar stood before him, his eyes scanning the corridor. Sarah, the public relations advisor, turned on her phone. The screen flashed with fresh news. The headlines were mottled. "Scandalous speech by Prince Abdulaziz in Toronto." Right below were angry comments overflowing with easily understood words. Contempt, not assent, not needed. And without translation, it was clear that the wave of indignation was growing. Abdulaziz closed his eyes for a moment, but not because of these lines. Clearest of all before him was the hand gripping his shoulder in the thick smoke, and the determined female voice at his ear. "Keep walking. Breathe slowly." For the first time in many years he was led, not leading. He obeyed, rather than forcing others to obey. A strange feeling, simultaneously confused and relieved. He removed the cloth, looked at his clean fingers, neatly trimmed nails, the black shiny ring trembling slightly. An indescribable feeling crept into his chest. Not quite fear, not quite shame, just the realization that the confidence that was on the podium was no longer there. "Your Highness, are you all right?" Omar leaned in, his voice tense as a string. Abdulaziz nodded briefly. "I am all right." Then, but he himself knew that this answer was empty. On the other side of the lobby, the woman in the paramedic uniform appeared in his field of vision again. She knelt on one knee, bandaging the wrist of a hotel employee who had cut himself. Her hair was wet and stuck in strands to her neck, gray spots spread on her jacket. She didn't look at anyone for longer than a second, didn't say a single unnecessary word. Having finished with one, she moved on to another. She was like a stream of water flowing exactly to where it burns. "Who is she?" Abdulaziz asked quietly. Omar quickly glanced at an employee. "They say she is an emergency doctor named Isabel." Sarah stepped closer. "If we meet with her now, we can soften the story. One photograph, a couple of lines." Abdulaziz turned to her, and his cold look forced Sarah to fall silent. "I don't need a story. I want to see her." He leaned on his hands and stood up. His body was still weak, but an invisible force pulled him forward. With every step, his long robe slightly touched the floor, leaving a thin trail of soot. Isabel, having finished the dressing, raised her head and their eyes met. She nodded slightly as people greet each other who are too busy for ceremonies. Is it easier for you to breathe? The question was short and to the point. Abdulaziz was confused for a moment. All his life he had been asked about contracts, profits, agreements. Rarely did anyone ask how he was breathing. Better, thank you. She only murmured in response and turned to calm an elderly woman with trembling hands. Not a single unnecessary word, not a single duty smile. It seemed that for her, gratitude is something that others keep in their soul and do not put on display. A hotel employee ran up. There are several more people on the first floor coughing heavily. Hands are needed in the field hospital. Doctor! Isabel stood up immediately, taking the medical kit. She threw a short glance at Abdulaziz. Her voice was even. If you can walk, follow me. There you will see something more than smoke and spotlights. Without any irony, but Abdulaziz heard a knock at the door in her words. He nodded. The movement was so short that Omar did not have time to object. I am coming. Sarah froze. Your Highness, are you sure? Her gaze quickly slid over the cameras of several reporters loitering nearby. This was an unsafe media scenario. I am sure, answered Abdulaziz and turned to Omar. You will come with me. The three followed Isabel to the exit. Outside, a fine rain began to drizzle, washing the smell of smoke from their clothes. A small ambulance was already waiting, its lights pulsating like a runner's heart. The car door opened. The smell of antiseptic hit the nose, mixed with the smell of new plastic. Isabel signaled to get in. The seats were hard and cramped. Inside there were already two people, a stage worker with a grey face and a middle-aged woman pressing her hand to her chest and coughing. Isabel gave the woman an inhaler. Her finger tapped lightly on the canister. Inhale deeply. For the other, she placed a small pillow under his head, aligned his neck, checked his pupils with a phone flashlight. Everything is fine. Don't try to talk. The car shuddered and moved, the wail of the siren cutting a narrow path through the city streets. Toronto floated by behind the murky glass. Low roofs, dimly glowing signs, a few people in thin raincoats hurrying about their business. With every frame that flashed by, Abdulaziz saw what he hadn't paid attention to for a long time. Life that didn't need him. Isabel gathered her hair into a bun and turned to Abdulaziz. Did you have asthma or an allergy to smoke? No. Tonight you will cough. Drink warm water, not cold. If chest pain continues, go to the emergency room. Understood? Abdulaziz smiled faintly. It was a short, ironic smile. He didn't remember the last time someone advised him to drink warm water. Understood. Omar, sitting opposite, maintained a wary look. He tilted his head slightly. We can move to another hotel, Your Highness. Security and image. Abdulaziz didn't answer immediately. He looked at the middle-aged woman who had stopped coughing, her hand tightly gripping the handrail, gradually relaxed. He looked at Isabel, who was writing some numbers on a crumpled piece of paper. Her handwriting was small and even. She no longer looked at him. For her, he was just one of many. The car turned into iron gates and drove into the yard of a two-story building with brightly lit windows. A temporary sign. Field Medical Point. Outside, several volunteers were distributing water and thin blankets. Inside, rows of cots stood. Pulse oximeters beeped. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the smell of rain flying in through the open door. No one raised their head when Abdulaziz entered. They were busy. Isabel led the woman to a bed, adjusted the pillow, called over a young paramedic to hand over the shift. Having finished, she pointed to a plastic chair by the table. Sit there. Rest for a few minutes. I will return. Abdulaziz sat. For the first time in a day, he was not surrounded by lenses. There was no applause, no slogans, only the beep of devices, someone's cough, hurried footsteps, and something else. The naked meaning of being here. This was not a forum, not a speech, and certainly not the words he had thrown. Sarah came closer and whispered, "The press is still seething. If needed, I will prepare a new statement to fix everything." Abdulaziz shook his head. Not yet. He looked around, his gaze stopped on a boy holding his reddened throat. then shifted to an old man with eyes still watering. Later. Isabel returned and handed him a glass of warm water. Drink in small sips. Don't rush. When she was about to leave, but Abdulaziz called out, "Isabel." She stopped, waiting. "Thank you." 2 words sounded not in a formal tone, without a business card, without a reward. Simply "thank you." Isabel nodded, the same short movement as before, and walked away. Abdulaziz watched her go. In the fine rain of the evening city, he suddenly saw how huge the gap was between his morning statement and this room. A gap that needed to be filled with actions, not hastily written apologies. He put down the glass and exhaled slowly. "Omar," he said in an even voice, "tomorrow we are not moving to another hotel. We are staying here. I want to see everything to the end." Omar froze for a second, then nodded. Understood. Abdulaziz leaned back on the chair, looking at the yellowed ceiling, listening to the rain beating evenly on the iron roof. For the first time in a day, his chest wasn't tight. It turns out that breathing slowly is also a way to listen. Stepping out of the ambulance, Abdulaziz froze for a moment. The courtyard of the field hospital was a concrete area flooded with rainwater. Hastily hung fluorescent lamps cast a cold white light, so unlike the warm, luxurious lighting of the 5-star hotel he had just left. Under an iron canopy, rows of blue plastic chairs stood tightly packed. People sat, lay down, some were covered with thin blankets. There was no red carpet, no lenses, only pale, soot-stained faces, tired but resilient gazes. Isabel got out first, quickly picked up a girl who was carried out of the car, laid her on her side, ensuring the airway was open. Her voice remained even, without a single note of doubt. A young paramedic ran up with a small oxygen tank. Abdulaziz stood a few steps away, observing her precise, almost cold movements. Apply the stethoscope, quickly make a record, nod. Stable. Abdulaziz was used to spacious conference halls with cool air-conditioned air and soft leather armchairs. But here he sat on a shaky plastic chair. An old board served as a tabletop, and a glass of water was handed to him by a hand smelling of alcohol. When Sarah frowned squeamishly, he stopped her with a nod of his head. He himself was surprised. For the first time he wanted to simply sit and not move. The sounds around merged into a strange symphony. The squeak of pulse oximeters, the slapping of rubber slippers, voices asking to bring more saline. "Check bed number 3. There was no applause, no eulogies, and yet everyone moved in a strict rhythm, like a mechanism working on responsibility, not on bonuses. A middle-aged man entered. His shoulder was covered in soot, eyes red from smoke. He tightly hugged his little daughter, endlessly repeating, "Thank you, thank you." Isabel only nodded, signaling a nurse to take the girl for an examination. The father didn't have time to finish speaking before she was already giving instructions to a young man carrying an oxygen tank. For her, gratitude did not require an answer. Abdulaziz watched, involuntarily clenching his fists. Pictures of shareholder meetings with mountains of papers floated in his head, the complete opposite of what he saw here. There, one signature of his could deprive thousands of people of work. Here, one nod from Isabel could save a life. He turned to Omar and said quietly, "In my country, people like her would be honored." Omar muttered, "It is like that everywhere, Your Highness. The question is only whether we want to see it." This answer forced Abdulaziz to fall silent. He looked at Sarah, but she was busy covering the lens of a reporter who had stuck his head in the door. "No filming now," she said, trying to control the image, but Abdulaziz suddenly realized that this was no longer necessary. Isabel walked past, noticing that Abdulaziz was still sitting motionless. "Are you feeling better?" "I'm fine." "Then come with me." "Where?" "To the warehouse." Abdulaziz stood up, slower than usual. The king of multi-billion-dollar deals followed the paramedic doctor down a dark corridor. It smelled of dampness and alcohol. The warehouse was just a small room. Iron shelves were cluttered with bandages, boxes of medicines, systems for IVs. In the corner, old cardboard boxes with peeling labels were piled up. Isabel pointed to several white refrigerated containers against the wall. "This is a batch of medical equipment being prepared for shipment. If the cold isn't maintained, it can be thrown away." Abdulaziz approached and put his hand on the lid of the container. Cold, but not enough. The temperature sensor blinked, warning of an imminent exceeding of the safe threshold. He frowned. In the medical contracts he read, there were only numbers and conditions. He never thought he would see with his own eyes how equipment could spoil in just a few hours without cold. This hospital doesn't have a specialized warehouse. We use a temporary one. We need to find a way to transport this immediately, Isabel explained briefly, not taking her eyes off the data table on the wall. A question arose in Abdulaziz's head. And if I invest money? But he swallowed it. Now was not the time. The fluorescent lamp flickered, casting a long shadow from Isabel onto the wall. A small but determined figure. Abdulaziz suddenly thought that on stage he was the center of attention. Everyone looked at him. But here, among rusty iron shelves, the center was exactly her. Sarah whispered quietly, "Your Highness, you don't need to stay here long. We can return to another hotel, prepare for the press conference." Abdulaziz shook his head. "Not yet." His voice was decisive, not like usual. Omar looked at him, frowning slightly, but said nothing. A young employee ran in. "Dr. Isabel, a call from the transport department." They reported. The phrase was swallowed by noise, but Isabel's tense look told Abdulaziz that the news was bad. Isabel exhaled and looked at Abdulaziz. "The transport company handling refrigerated shipments has officially refused. This batch may have to be written off." The scene in Abdulaziz's head collapsed to another level. He had just seen with his own eyes what could save hundreds of people and what could become a pile of useless cold metal because of one decision to give up. He looked at Isabel. For the first time his voice softened. "What are you going to do?" Isabel answered briefly, "Find another way." This short answer made Abdulaziz's heart beat faster, because he knew that find another way means she will not accept defeat, and he suddenly realized that perhaps he himself should not leave right now. An old rattling van roared, its headlights cutting through the damp night mist. Abdulaziz sat in the back seat. His robe, stained with soot from the fire, was now soaked with the smell of gasoline as well. Next to him closely stood crates of medical equipment. Several boxes of warm clothes were securely fastened with ropes. Isabel sat in the front, holding onto the door with one hand, her gaze riveted to the dark, winding road that snaked around the mountains. Toronto remained behind, the road leading them further into the hinterland. Abdulaziz had never seen such thick darkness. Not the dim haze under streetlights, but a dense, viscous gloom that was sliced into slices only by the light of the headlights. The mountain wind penetrated through cracks in the door, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, which clogged under his keffiyeh. The car stopped in a small village nestled on the slope of a hill. Low wooden houses with roofs of faded slate, dim yellow light broke through cracks in the windows. The barking of dogs. Children's voices drifting from the night silence. Abdulaziz got out, his feet stepped into mud which stuck to the hem of his clothes. He frowned but did not complain. Isabel commanded loudly, "Bring the equipment into the community hall." She rolled up her sleeves herself, lifted a heavy refrigerated container, and walked confidently through the mud. People from the village in old worn jackets came out to help. This picture was unfamiliar to Abdulaziz. No contracts, no payment, only rolled up sleeves and bright eyes in the night. In the wooden house, kerosene lamps were hung high. A long line of children stood waiting. Their eyes were wide open. They hugged each other. A hunched old woman handed Isabel a cup of hot water with trembling hands. "Doctor, drink, warm up." Isabel smiled, took a sip and leaned down to give an injection to the first child. Abdulaziz stood nearby, watching how the needle glinted in the light of the kerosene lamp, how the child's small hand trembled, how a cry escaped. But Isabel spoke soothingly. "It's okay. It's okay. All done." The child fell silent in surprise, having received a small cookie from her pocket. An old man sat by the stove, wrapped in a patched wool sweater. His cloudy eyes looked attentively at Abdulaziz. "Foreigner, eh?" he asked in broken English. Abdulaziz didn't understand. Isabel quickly translated. "The old man asks where you came from." "From Arabia," answered Abdulaziz briefly. The old man nodded, smiling toothlessly. "So far away and you came. A respected person. Just one word. Respected. Simple, without ceremonies, made Abdulaziz taken aback. All his life he heard "Your Highness," "Your Royal Majesty." But in this wooden house with cracks in the walls through which the wind blew, the old man said only "respected," and bent down again to stroke his grandson's head. The old loudspeaker outside came to life. With a crackle it announced, "Attention, a medical team has arrived in the village. Residents, come to the community hall for vaccinations and to receive warm clothes." The sound carried through the night silence, and following it, hurried footsteps were heard. More people came. They crowded into the small room. Isabel turned to Abdulaziz. "If you want to help, hold this list. Whoever enters, put a check mark. Simple." Abdulaziz froze for a moment. All his life he was used to signing multi-billion-dollar contracts, but never checked off recipients of jackets on a list. But he nodded, took the pen. Short Canadian names. He put a check mark, handed out a jacket, a cookie. Every time a pair of shining eyes looked at him, thanking without words, with a smile. Omar stood nearby, sighing quietly. "Your Highness, I have never seen you like this." Abdulaziz didn't answer. He was busy watching a girl who, hugging a new warm jacket, skipped out the door. The blue jacket was too big for her, but her eyes shone. Outside, a fine rain drizzled. Abdulaziz stepped out, raised his face and inhaled the cold air deeply. Before him in the fog, mountains were vaguely outlined. The barking of dogs and ringing children's laughter could be heard. He remembered his words spoken during the day on the podium. They sounded in his head, burning stronger than any applause he had ever received. Isabel came out and stood nearby, still holding a box of instruments in her hands. "You are doing well." Abdulaziz grinned wryly. "Just putting check marks." "No, you stayed and are doing. For them, that is enough." She looked into the night darkness. Her voice became quieter. "In places where everything is lacking, anyone who is ready to stand in line becomes part of the mechanism. No orders are needed." Abdulaziz was silent in the darkness. For the first time he felt that he was in his place, even thanks to such a small action. Late night. A fire crackled in the stove. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of antiseptic. People slept huddled on mats, several children curled up in a ball, hugging new jackets. Abdulaziz sat in the corner, leaning against the wooden wall. His robe was soaked with the smell of ash, mud, and smoke. He listened to the even tapping of the rain, and his soul felt lighter. In the dim light, his gaze stopped on Isabel, who was writing a report. A thin but resilient figure. Amidst this simple poverty, she radiated a different power, not authority, but the power of faith. Abdulaziz clenched his fists. He suddenly thought that if that batch of equipment had really spoiled, these people would have suffered. For the first time he felt something going beyond the limits of personal honor, beyond the limits of profit. And he realized that tomorrow the real battle would begin. The night in the mountains dragged on slowly. Fine rain tapped on the iron roof of the community hall, mixing with the even breathing of people asleep after a long day. Inside, several kerosene lamps cast a dim yellow light on the wooden walls. Abdulaziz did not sleep. He sat leaning against a support pillar with eyes wide open, clearly hearing the beating of his own heart in the silence of the mountains. Omar lay in the corner, dozing wearily while Sarah buried herself in her phone. The signal was weak, but she managed to catch scraps of news. Down below in the cities, social networks were still seething because of his statement during the day. Comments in English flowed in a continuous stream. Sarah quickly translated a few phrases for Abdulaziz. They were heavy, caustic, even angry words. Abdulaziz closed his eyes quietly, not reacting. He knew that his image now was not a brilliant investor but a symbol of foreign arrogance. The wooden door opened with a creak. Isabel entered, her jacket darkened by the rain. She walked straight to the wooden table in the center of the room, placed a folder with documents and several telegrams on it. "New information," she said briefly. All eyes turned to her. Abdulaziz leaned forward slightly. "The transport company handling refrigerated shipments has just officially announced a refusal," said Isabel in a voice calm to the point of coldness. They cite a lack of personnel and high risks, but in reality they are afraid of liability after today's fire. Sarah lowered her phone, her face changed. Omar frowned. And what about that batch of medical equipment? Isabel raised her head, her eyes shining brightly in the darkness. If we don't transport it on time, everything will spoil. Too long without cold, and it's just scrap metal. Silence reigned in the room. Abdulaziz felt his chest tighten. He looked at the white refrigerated containers against the wall, on which the red temperature indicator blinked. Inside were hundreds of sets of life-saving equipment, thousands of doses of medicines requiring cold. Before, for him, these were just numbers, investments, profits and losses. But after one night in this village, after he looked into the eyes of children and old people sleeping now wrapped in blankets, he saw specific lives in this. If everything spoils, it won't be statistical tables that suffer, but those very faces that just smiled receiving warm jackets. "Are there other options?" asked Abdulaziz in a husky but distinct voice. Isabel nodded. "There are, but difficult ones." Omar intervened. "Your Highness, you don't need to get involved in this. We can hire an international transport company, pay double, triple more. They will do it." Isabel shook her head. "We won't make it in time. We have only a few dozen hours left before the temperature exceeds the norm. With outsiders, time will be spent on negotiations, paperwork processing. I want to use the local railway. At the big station below there is a transfer warehouse. If continuity is maintained, the cargo can be saved." Sarah frowned. "Railway? Who uses it in our time? Slow, backward." Isabel did not answer. She only laid out a diagram of the railway tracks on the table, tapping her finger on red dots. "Departure station, transfer station, reserve refrigerated warehouse. I already called, they are ready to help, but someone needs to coordinate on the spot, without paperwork, red tape, without delays." It became quiet in the room again. Abdulaziz stared at the old paper with blurred ink. Compared to the gilded contracts he usually saw, this was so primitive. But in this primitiveness he saw the only bright path. He raised his head, his voice was firm. "I will participate." Omar flinched. "Your Highness, it is dangerous. You don't need to—" Abdulaziz interrupted him. "It was I who stood on the podium today. It was I who spoke insulting words. If I leave now, who will I remain? Just a coward." Sarah was stunned. She had never heard Abdulaziz use the word coward in relation to himself. Isabel showed no emotions, just nodded briefly. "Good. That means from this moment you are also a team member. No exceptions." Abdulaziz exhaled. For the first time he felt that this answer was like a contract not requiring a signature. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming on the iron roof. Inside, the flickering light of the kerosene lamp illuminated tired but determined faces. That batch of medical equipment was now not someone's personal problem. It was a test for the whole team, and for the crown prince who had just lost his reputation in the shining hall. Abdulaziz leaned against the wooden wall, his hand gripping the edge of his robe. For the first time in his life, he clearly felt that he was about to enter a deal measured not in dollars, but in human lives. The old wooden table was pushed to the middle of the rural community hall. On it lay a blurred diagram of the railway on yellowed paper. The kerosene lamp suspended above the table swung from the draft, casting a trembling light on the faces gathered around. Isabel, Abdulaziz, Omar, Sarah, and a few local officials. Isabel pointed a finger at the map. Her voice was decisive. "We will deliver the cargo to the regional station. It is more than 60 kilometers from here. From there, the night freight train will go straight to Toronto. At the transfer station, there is a temporary refrigerated warehouse. If we manage to reload, the cargo will be safe." Omar knitted his bushy eyebrows. "The mountain road is dangerous, plus rain, slippery. Delivering the cargo to the station will not be easy. Not to mention the Canadian railway. I don't believe it can work accurately." Isabel raised her head and looked him straight in the eye. "Do we have another choice?" The air thickened. Sarah intervened, her voice full of calculation. "We can hire a private jet. Expenses will be many times greater, but His Highness Abdulaziz can pay. By air it will be many times faster and safer." Isabel shook her head, Determination flashed in her eyes. We won't make it. Flight permission, preparation. This will take at least 2 days, and we have a little more than 40 hours left before the temperature exceeds the norm. Everyone fell silent. Abdulaziz sat motionless. His hand lay on the refrigerated container nearby. Red numbers on the temperature sensor blinked like a rapid heartbeat. He raised his head. His voice was husky but distinct. We will go by railway. Omar turned sharply, stunned. Your Highness, this is an adventure. A crown prince cannot put himself in such a position. Abdulaziz looked straight at Omar. In his gaze there was no longer the usual arrogance. Something else shone in it. Have you forgotten? I put myself in this position myself when I stood on the podium and spoke words of contempt. If I leave now, what will remain except the image of a fugitive? Omar lost the power of speech. Sarah wanted to say something, but Abdulaziz's firm look forced her to fall silent. Isabel nodded briefly. Her voice was calm. Then agreed. Tonight we prepare everything. Tomorrow morning we leave. She laid out another sheet of paper listing tasks. One is responsible for documents for the train, another prepares a small truck for lowering the cargo from the mountain, a group deals with additional packing of dry ice. She distributed tasks like an officer commanding a battle. Everyone hurriedly wrote down, the rustle of pens mixed with the tapping of rain on the roof. Abdulaziz watched silently. He realized that Isabel didn't need to shout or use power. Every order of hers forced people to act immediately. This authority came from accuracy and reliability, not from rank. When the meeting ended, Omar took Abdulaziz to the corner. His voice was sharp. Your Highness, you cannot get so deeply involved in this. The press has already targeted you. If something happens on the road now, the image will become even worse. Abdulaziz answered slowly. Precisely because the press has already branded me arrogant, I must face reality. If there is a risk, I will at least know that I did it. Omar looked at his master, helplessness and respect mixed in his gaze. The man whom he had served for so many years, always cold in multi-billion-dollar deals, now spoke with such firmness, standing before a small train with medical equipment. Sarah intervened, trying to return the situation to a familiar track. We can use this opportunity. If the press finds out that the Crown Prince is personally participating in help, the image will change. I will organize reporters. Abdulaziz raised his hand, interrupting her. No cameras, no interviews. This is not a PR campaign. These words made Sarah freeze. For the first time, she saw Abdulaziz reject the weapon he usually used to manipulate public opinion. That night, when everyone was sleeping, Abdulaziz still sat by the containers, his gaze riveted to the blinking numbers. He thought about the hundreds of eyes in the village, about Isabel's calm voice. If the cold isn't maintained, it can be thrown away. And for the first time he felt his heart beating not because of profit, but because of a very simple fear. Fear that all this would spoil, fear that tomorrow they wouldn't make it in time. The rain outside the window intensified. The kerosene lamp swung on the ceiling. Abdulaziz closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time he clearly realized that tomorrow is no longer the schedule of a crown prince, but the schedule of a member of this small team. He mentally said to himself, tomorrow I will go with them, whatever the result. It hadn't dawned yet, but thick fog already enveloped the dirt road leading from the village. The small column consisted of just one old truck and several accompanying motorcycles. In the truck bed, white refrigerated containers were securely fastened with ropes and covered with a tarp. Abdulaziz came out. His white robe was replaced by a thick grey jacket given to him by locals. The keffiyeh, soaked with smoke, was now tied more neatly so as not to interfere. Isabel stood in front of the truck cabin, her gaze gliding over every person, every rope, every lock. We have only one attempt. If even one container falls, it's all over, she said. Her voice was short, but that was enough for everyone to tighten their belts. Abdulaziz approached, put his hand on the icy side of the container. He took a deep breath. His hands, accustomed to signing multi-billion-dollar contracts, now tightly gripped the rope, checking every knot. Omar frowned but did not stop him. Perhaps he too understood that his master was no longer the same as before. The vehicle moved. The road wound on one side. a sheer cliff on the other, a bottomless abyss. Fog hid visibility. The truck's wheels churned the slippery mud, slipping a little before finding traction again. Abdulaziz sat in the truck bed, not taking his eyes off the containers. Every time the vehicle was tossed, his heart stopped. Isabel sat next to the driver, constantly reminding, "Low gear, slower on the turn, keep left." Her voice was decisive, leaving no room for fear. Halfway, the road was blocked by a large pit filled with water. The vehicle braked, rear wheels deeply stuck in the mud. The driver pressed the gas, but the wheels only spun in place, spraying mud. The whole team jumped out anxiously. Everyone began to push together. "Push!" shouted Isabel. Abdulaziz jumped down first. The mud reached his ankles, sticky and viscous. He dug his shoulder into the truck bed and pushed hard. Omar also rushed to help. Sarah stood behind Abdulaziz, looking with disbelief as the crown prince, whom she accompanied to countless luxurious forums, now got dirty in the mud. "Push!" A friendly shout rang out. Wheels grated on the mud. Abdulaziz's back was wet with sweat. The grey jacket was covered with spots. Hands slipped on the mud, but he, clenching his teeth, strained all his strength. Finally, the truck broke out of the pit. He sat on the ground, breathing heavily, heart pounding, the smell of mud hitting his nose. Isabel walked past, handing him a bottle of water. "Good job!" Her voice was not flattery, rather a statement of fact. Abdulaziz nodded, took a sip and felt the hot water burn his throat. The column moved on. The descent became steeper and more slippery. The fog was thick as a curtain. At every turn, everyone held their breath. Once the truck tilted so much that it seemed it was about to tip over. Abdulaziz held on tightly to the rope, looking into the abyss covered by clouds. For the first time, he so clearly felt the fragility of what he was protecting. Halfway, the column stopped at a small shack made of planks. The owner was a gray-haired old woman. She brought out a pot of boiling water and several dented aluminum mugs. "Drink, warm up," she said, looking at everyone with hospitality. Abdulaziz took a mug. It was not expensive coffee, not imported alcohol, but just weak tea, but in the throat, it felt unusually warm. Isabel used the moment to call the regional station. Her voice was decisive. "We are coming down. Keep the refrigerated warehouse ready. The night freight train must depart on time." Hanging up the phone, she turned. "We have 6 hours to get to the station. If we are late, everything is lost." Abdulaziz squeezed the mug in his hand, listening to the howl of the wind in the gorge. 6 hours, measured by every jolt, every meter of the slippery road. The column moved again. The sky began to lighten. Weak rays of the sun broke through the fog, opening a view of the distant valley, of terrace fields flooded with rainwater, of slowly wandering oxen. Abdulaziz looked at this landscape and his soul felt lighter. But he immediately looked again at the blinking red numbers on the container. 3.1 degrees. Enough to rise to 4, and everything would be in danger. Isabel turned around. Their eyes met. "Don't look away. You must report as soon as the numbers change." Abdulaziz nodded. For the first time in his life, he received a task measured not by money, but by lives. The vehicle shuddered again. The motor roared. Abdulaziz sat next to the container, his gaze riveted to the small red screen. He felt his heart beating in time with these numbers. Every passing second, every meter overcome. It was like a step toward concluding a strange contract, a contract with his own conscience. When the truck drove out from the last descent, the red-tiled roofs of the regional station appeared in the distance. The whistle of a train reached through the fog, echoing in Abdulaziz's chest like a battle horn. He involuntarily clenched his fists and whispered, "We must make it." And at that moment his gaze accidentally met Isabel's gaze in the rearview mirror. Not a word, but both knew that this was no longer their personal business. It was a battle in which every hand participated, every heartbeat. The regional station appeared in the fog, an old building with peeling yellow plaster and a mossy tiled roof. On the platform a train hooted lingeringly. Its sound broke the silence of the mountains. Several freight cars of faded blue color stood motionless on the rails. Rusty wheels shone in the weak morning light. The truck stopped right at the gates. Isabel jumped out of the cabin and without having time to catch her breath, shouted loudly, "Unload! Check the temperature immediately!" A group of station workers in orange vests was already waiting. Their tanned faces were tense. They rushed together with the locals to tear off the tarp and untie the ropes. Abdulaziz jumped down too. His leather boots were soaked with water and covered with a thick layer of mud, but he no longer paid attention to this. He bent down and together with Omar lifted a heavy refrigerated container. His shoulders tensed. It seemed they were about to tear. But when he put it on the concrete floor, he felt a strange sensation. The container seemed to carry the breath of the whole village, those eyes that he saw last night. Isabel knelt down to look at the temperature sensor. 3.8 degrees, she said quickly. Threshold not yet exceeded, but little time left. Everyone hurried. Refrigerated containers were passed along a living chain from the truck to the temporary refrigerated warehouse. Rhythmic shouts were heard. 1, 2, 3, pass! Sweat, breathing, hurried steps merged into a single rhythm. Abdulaziz stood in the chain, shoulder to shoulder with a thin young man with calloused hands. Taking the container from his hands, Abdulaziz froze for a moment. The guy's hands were trembling. There were cracks on them. He looked into his eyes and saw a shine in them, but not a shadow of a complaint. Sarah stood aside. Cameras of reporters loitering outside made her nervous. Your Highness, you cannot let them see you in this form. Abdulaziz interrupted her in a husky but sharp voice. Turn off all cameras. If filming continues, I will go out to them myself. For the first time, Sarah saw her master completely reject the power of media. They moved 10 containers, 15. Sweat poured in a stream. Abdulaziz's white robe was all in mud. He no longer looked like a crown prince, but his eyes burned brighter, hands became stronger. Every time he put a container in the refrigerated warehouse, the blinking red numbers dropped to a safe mark. Isabel stood in the middle of the warehouse and commanded, place 10 centimeters from the wall, don't stack on top of each other, check dry ice, add. She moved quickly, her gaze covering every corner, hands knew no rest. When the last container was in place, Isabel exhaled with relief. Stable, temperature holding. Everyone applauded. These were not duty applause, but a sound torn from the chest, from relief. Abdulaziz sat on a step, breathing heavily, sweat flowing down his cheeks. Omar handed him a bottle of water, but Abdulaziz took only a sip. His gaze riveted to the row of white refrigerated containers. In his eyes, they were no longer soulless cargo, but lives that had names and faces. The train whistle sounded again. A station worker raised his hand. The night freight train departs in 40 minutes. If we don't manage to load, we'll have to wait for the morning flight. Isabel turned sharply. No morning, loading onto this train. The whole team rushed back to work. Containers were passed hand to hand, placed on an old wooden conveyor and pushed into the freight car. Inside the car it was dark and smelled of rusty metal. Abdulaziz together with Omar lifted the containers. Shoulders ached, chest whined, but when he heard the click of the lock securely fastening the container in the car, he felt excitement, like after a one large deal. 1 container, 2, 10. Every impact on the car floor sounded like a drumbeat. Outside, local residents shouted, children ran and watched with burning eyes. They didn't know who Abdulaziz was. They saw only a tall foreigner with dirty sleeves who carried refrigerated containers together with them. Finally, all containers were in the train. Isabel went up to check one last time. Temperature sensors were stable. She turned to Abdulaziz and nodded. First part finished. He exhaled. He was exhausted, but his lips involuntarily curved into a smile. For the first time, he understood that a smile comes not from victory on the stock exchange, but from sweat and heartbeat merged with the collective rhythm. The traffic light at the station turned green. A lingering train whistle swept through the district. Wheels grated on the rails. The whole train shuddered and moved. Abdulaziz stood on the step of the car. Early wind hit his face, bringing with it the smell of rust and cold steam. He looked at the waving people on the platform, at their thin but strong hands. Isabel approached and stood nearby holding the iron handrail, her gaze fixed on the rails going forward. We have covered only half the way, she said in an even voice. Abdulaziz nodded, not taking his eyes off the fog ahead. In his soul, for the first time, a strange confidence was born that this train was carrying not just cargo, but a chance for him to correct his mistake. The rumble of the train spread through the mountains, opening a new race. A race in which Abdulaziz was no longer a crown prince on a podium, but simply a person who, with all his might together with everyone, was saving containers with hope. The knocking of wheels on rails was even, like the beating of a giant heart. The train rushed through the misty mountains, swaying on turns. In the freight car, Abdulaziz sat leaning against a cold container, his gaze riveted to the small red number on the screen. 3.2 degrees. It was enough to rise another half degree, and hundreds of sets of equipment could turn into scrap metal. Isabel walked around the car, checking every lock, every container. Her mud-stained boots knocked on the old iron floor. When the train entered a dark tunnel, the beam of her flashlight slid over Abdulaziz's face. Their eyes met. Without words, but with a silent understanding that they share one anxiety. Suddenly the train whistle howled unusually long. The train began to slow down. Wheels squeaked piercingly. Everyone was rocked. Several containers shook violently. Abdulaziz jumped up, clinging tightly to the fastening rope. A crackling voice came from the speakers. "Urgent message. Accident on the iron bridge ahead. Train forced to stop for inspection. Estimated delay time unknown." The atmosphere instantly became leaden. Sarah clung to the edge of the seat, her face turned pale. Omar clenched his fists. Abdulaziz looked at Isabel in hope of reassurance, but she too froze for a moment and then shouted loudly, "Check the temperature immediately!" A young volunteer with a sensor ran along the row. 3.9, 4.0, rising. Everyone froze. If the train stands for a long time, the temperature will exceed the norm. All efforts from the village to the station will go to waste. Isabel bit her lip, her eyes burning. "We can't sit and wait. We need to find a temporary refrigerated warehouse nearby." One of the railway workers said hurriedly, 2 kilometers from here at the auxiliary station there is a warehouse for storing fruit. But the cargo will have to be carried along a country road. There is no coupling. Abdulaziz immediately asked, "Do we have transport?" The man shook his head. "Only a few handcarts from locals." Silence reigned in the car. Sarah whispered, "This is impossible. This is too much." Abdulaziz took a deep breath. His voice was husky but firm. "We will do it. There is no other way." Isabel nodded. Her gaze was like a flame. "Right. Everyone out. Divide into groups." The car door swung open. A gust of icy mountain wind hit the face. Outside, the train froze by the mountain slope. The silhouette of the motionless iron bridge was visible in the distance. Fine rain drizzled. The ground was slippery. Residents of surrounding houses had already run up, dragging ox carts and wooden carts with them. No long explanations were needed. One phrase, "cargo to save lives," was enough for them to rush to help. Abdulaziz, together with Omar, lifted a refrigerated container and put it on a cart. Shoulders burned, the robe soaked with mud was heavy, but he didn't stop. Isabel led the column, commanding loudly, "Walk in single file. Hold ropes tight." The column of people slowly dragged the cargo along the muddy road. Wooden wheels creaked on stones, rain intensified, soaking hair and clothes, but no one dropped the cargo. One container slipped off the cart and almost fell into a puddle. Abdulaziz rushed forward and together with a young guy held it. Their hands interlocked tightly, mud splashed into their faces. Abdulaziz breathed heavily, but when the container was safely hoisted back in place, he laughed huskily, as if he found a strange joy in these difficulties. Isabel turned around and shouted, "Faster! Temperature already 4.1! Finally, the lights of the auxiliary warehouse appeared. A row of simple hangars made of corrugated iron gates with peeling paint. An elderly storekeeper hurriedly opened them. Cold blew from inside. The whole column poured inside, passing containers from hand to hand and placing them on cold shelves. Cold steam swirled in the air. Isabel applied the sensor. Her voice sounded clearly. 3.9! Falling! A joyful hum swept through the warehouse. People clapped their hands. Several boys shouted, "Hooray!" Abdulaziz sat on the concrete floor. Sweat and rain mixed, chest heaved heavily. He looked at the row of white containers, and a new feeling overwhelmed him. A victory that belonged not to him alone, but to all hands that had just dragged the cargo through this dead section of the path. Omar sat nearby. His voice was still tense, but respect shone in his eyes. "I have never seen you like this, Your Highness." Abdulaziz sighed quietly. "I have never seen myself like this either." Isabel walked past, soaked from head to toe, hair stuck to her forehead. She stopped for a moment, looked at Abdulaziz. "You handled it, but this is not all. When the train moves, we will have to continue." Abdulaziz nodded. New determination shone in his eyes. He knew that this journey went far beyond simple transportation. It was a silent oath given to himself, not to let a single container spoil, not to let a single life perish because of his past arrogance. Outside, the train hooted lingeringly again. It was a signal that the iron bridge was free. The train was preparing to move. Inside the cold warehouse, among white containers and icy steam, Abdulaziz clenched his fists. This battle was still ongoing. The train whistle spread lingeringly through the valley, like an anthem of return. After almost 2 hours of tense waiting while the bridge was repaired, the train finally moved. In the temporary refrigerated warehouse, the whole team hurriedly loaded containers back onto carts to deliver them to the car. Sweat didn't have time to dry before rain whipped the face again, but this time no one complained. Isabel stood on the step of the car. Her gaze followed every transferred container. "Quickly but securely. Place in a row. Fasten ropes." Her distinct voice covered the noise of the rain. Abdulaziz, together with Omar, carried a heavy container. Shoulders went numb, hands trembled, but he didn't stop. With every step on the iron ladder, he heard his heart beating in time with the steps. Placing the container in place, he sank to the floor. Breathing was so frequent that it seemed it would tear the chest. One of the railway workers shouted, "That's it! Loaded!" The car door closed with a crash and was locked. The train jerked and started moving. Wheels squeaked piercingly, but this time it was the sound of hope. Everyone exhaled, as if they had passed through the gates of death. In the cramped car, people sank onto the cold iron floor, leaning against walls and breathing heavily. Omar shook his head, his wet hair matted. "Your Highness, I never thought I would see such a thing." Abdulaziz laughed huskily, his eyes shining. "Me neither." Isabel walked along the row of containers, checking fastenings. Making sure everything was in order, she sat in the corner leaning against a container and closed her eyes. There was obvious fatigue on her face, but a smile lurked in the corners of her lips. Abdulaziz saw this and suddenly laughed too. The first laugh in many tense days. Not a duty smile from press conferences, and certainly not an arrogant sneer at negotiations. It burst from the chest, rough, husky, but real. Sarah froze. She saw how Abdulaziz laughed signing a multi-billion-dollar deal, but never saw him laugh because of a saved container. The train raced across the plain. Through the small window, Abdulaziz saw endless green fields, flashing red roofs of houses. People by the railway track waved to the train. He involuntarily raised his hand and waved back. A little boy saw this, smiled joyfully and jumped. Abdulaziz's heart skipped a beat, as if he had just signed a contract with his own faith. Isabel, sitting nearby, asked quietly, "Why are you laughing?" Abdulaziz answered in a low but warm voice, "Because for the first time I saw what real victory is." Isabel was silent, only nodded briefly and looked again at the red numbers on the sensor. 3.3 gigahertz. Still safe. That night when the train entered the station in Toronto, the clock showed 3.1 gigahertz. Everyone exhaled with relief. The car door opened. White containers were unloaded one by one and neatly placed in the central warehouse. Bright light of spotlights illuminated sweat, mud, and shining smiles. One of the workers shouted loudly, "Cargo safe!" A joyful hum swept through the whole warehouse. Local residents, station workers, volunteers. Everyone hugged, patted each other on the shoulder, shouted. Abdulaziz stood in the center of this circle. His clothes were in mud, but eyes burned. He laughed, this time not huskily but loudly and long, his laughter merging with general jubilation. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filled with tears. She had never seen Abdulaziz like this. Omar nodded briefly. His gaze was heavy but warmed. Isabel approached and extended her hand. "We did it." Abdulaziz firmly shook her hand. The handshake was long and strong. At this moment, he clearly realized that this was no longer the story of a crown prince or an emergency doctor, but a story of equal people who dragged cargo together through the edge of life and death. On the platform, the rain stopped. Yellow light of lanterns spilled everywhere, reflecting in puddles. Abdulaziz raised his head and took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he felt it was so easy to breathe. The Toronto conference hall shone with lights again. This time it was not smoke and fire alarm, but dozens of lenses aimed at the podium. All seats were taken, faces tense, full of expectation and disbelief. People waited for what Crown Prince Abdulaziz would say after his scandalous and arrogant statement. Sarah stood backstage, tightly clutching a stack of papers in her hands. A pre-prepared press release with apologies was honed in diplomatic language, but Abdulaziz only glanced at it and didn't take it. He walked onto the podium, looking completely different than a few days ago. A simple white shirt, dark trousers, no long robe, no fancy keffiyeh, no royal luxury. A whisper went through the hall. "Is that definitely him?" whispered one journalist. "Yes, looks nothing like himself on the first day," answered another. Abdulaziz stood straight, his gaze gliding over the hall. He didn't dodge, didn't smile a diplomatic smile. His voice sounded husky but distinct. "A few days ago, right at this spot, I spoke insulting words. I said that Canada is not worth it for me to invest a single cent in it. And immediately after that, I was saved by Canadian people themselves amidst thick smoke." The hall buzzed, cameras clicked. Sarah held her breath, her palms sweated. Abdulaziz continued, enunciating every word. "I saw with my own eyes how a paramedic rushed into the smoke to pull me out, how residents of a distant village needed mud together with us pushing a truck, how railway workers worked in the rain to save a refrigerated warehouse. I saw your resilience and persistence, and I clearly understood one thing. My words that day were a mistake. They were arrogant and shameful." Noise in the hall intensified, but this time these were different whispers. Someone nodded briefly, someone took out a phone to record. Abdulaziz took a breath, his eyes burned like fire. "The last 3 days I did not sit in a luxurious hotel room. I was in a field hospital. I was in a distant village. I stood on a cold platform hauling containers, and I realized that value is measured not in dollars, but in saved lives. Canada taught me the most expensive lesson, a lesson of faith and responsibility." Applause began from the back rows and gradually swept the whole hall. Abdulaziz raised his hand, calling for silence, and sincerely added, "Today I ask for forgiveness. Not pre-prepared apologies, but apologies of a person whom you saved and whom you gave a chance to understand everything. I was wrong." Silence reigned for a few seconds, and then it exploded. The whole hall applauded. Applause was friendly, not scattered. Many tense faces relaxed, even smiled. Abdulaziz waited for applause to subside and continued, "I don't want to stop at words. I want to act. Today my investment fund will begin cooperation with Canadian companies to build a system of refrigerated warehouses and medical transport, starting from those very remote areas where I just was. I won't just invest money. I will stay, participate, and see the matter through to the end." Shouts of approval rang out. Cameras rushed about on live broadcast screens. Lines ran. Crown Prince Abdulaziz publicly apologized and pledged to invest in Canada. In the back row, Omar sat with a straight back. For the first time in his gaze, there was no usual wariness. It was replaced by poorly concealed pride. Sarah cried, but these were no longer tears of tension, but tears of relief. In the middle of the hall, unnoticed, sat a figure in a dark blue paramedic uniform. Isabel didn't applaud. She simply looked at the podium and a warm light flashed in her eyes. Abdulaziz finished bowing. There were no fireworks, no pathetic music, only endless applause sounding like a single beating of hearts. He stepped off the podium and headed straight to the row where Isabel sat. All lenses turned after him. Abdulaziz slightly bowed his head before her. Not a word, but the whole world understood whom he wanted to thank most of all. Night Toronto was flooded with dim yellow light of street lamps. The city still buzzed, but in the small room of the temporary field hospital, unusual silence reigned. Abdulaziz sat alone at an old wooden table. Before him lay a clean sheet of paper and a pen which he always carried with him. He wrote slowly. Every letter was clear. Respected council and royal family, I have made a decision to stay in Canada for some more time. I must personally oversee new projects not only as an investor, but also as a participant in this work. I realize that true value is not always measured by immediate profit. Sometimes one small action can save hundreds of lives, and I want to be part of this. Reaching this place, Abdulaziz stopped. He leaned back on the chair and looked at the peeling ceiling. Outside the window, rain rustled, the smell of dampness mixed with the familiar smell of antiseptic. He thought about nights in the desert, about gilded palaces, about luxurious feasts. All this suddenly seemed so alien, and the laughter of children who received warm jackets or joyful shouts when the last container was loaded into the train surfaced in memory so brightly as if it was yesterday. The wooden door opened with a creak. Isabel entered with a folder in her hands. She looked at the sheet of paper before Abdulaziz and asked quietly, "What are you writing?" "A letter home," answered Abdulaziz in a low voice. "I am telling them that I am staying. Probably for the first time in my life I am not asking what they think about it." Isabel smiled faintly. Her gaze softened. "So you signed a contract with yourself?" Abdulaziz nodded, looking at her attentively. "I have met many strong people, many powerful ones, but no one forced me to feel so small as next to you." Isabel only chuckled and turned away to continue making notes. "I was just doing my job, and you, yours." The next morning the sky cleared. At the Toronto station it was crowded. The last white containers were sealed and loaded into a freight car. Station workers, loaders, volunteers, and just passers-by stood in a crowd, their eyes shining with faith. Abdulaziz was in a simple shirt, without his arrogant white robe. He stood next to Isabel, looking at the train ready for departure. Omar and Sarah stood silently behind, not interfering. The train whistle sounded, wheels began to spin, the crowd applauded and shouted. Abdulaziz followed the train with his gaze, his chest filled with a strange feeling. He knew that this train carried not only medical equipment, it carried his faith in the land he once despised. Isabel turned and extended her hand. Abdulaziz looked at this hand, the hand that pulled him out of the fire, that helped him breathe, and firmly shook it. The handshake was silent, but in it was everything: gratitude, respect, and a silent promise. A voice came from the speakers. "Train number, departing." The train disappeared behind a misty haze, leaving behind only the fading knocking of wheels. Abdulaziz raised his head and took a deep breath. This time there was no smell of smoke, no suffocation, only the clean air of a new morning and firm determination in his heart. He whispered almost to himself, "In this place, when you fall, a hand will always be found that will lift you, not asking who you are, just to save." Isabel heard but didn't answer. She only looked after the departing train. Her gaze was calm, like distant blue mountains. Abdulaziz held a folded letter in his pocket. He knew that ahead there would be many trials, but for the first time in his life he was not afraid. At this noisy station, among ordinary people, the crown prince from the distant desert smiled for real. Not for glory, not for a contract, but because he found something greater than all this: faith in the human hand. On the last day in Toronto, the sky after the rain was clear. Along a small road leading out of the city, an old blue truck drove slowly. In the truck bed lay several new, carefully packed crates with medical equipment and boxes with medicines, which were being sent further to the mountain regions. People on both sides of the road raised their heads and waved when the medical team drove past. Children ran behind and shouted, their hair waving in the wind. Abdulaziz stood on the roadside in a simple white shirt, shoving his hands in his pockets, and watched them go. Omar, like a shadow, stood nearby, but in his pose there was no longer tension. Sarah held a phone but didn't film, only watched, smiling slightly. In the truck bed among her colleagues sat Isabel. Her dark blue uniform was worn, hair neatly gathered back. She didn't look in Abdulaziz's direction. She only leaned down to check the list, and in an even voice instructed a young paramedic. "When we arrive in the village, distribute everything exactly. Don't make anyone wait too long. When the vehicle disappeared from sight, Abdulaziz went up the steps of the old station where he waited. In his hands was a preliminary agreement, just signed with the owner of a medical equipment factory, about the project of the first refrigerated warehouse in Canada. A simple sheet of paper without frills, but for him it had the value of a new chapter. He raised his head. The wind fluttered his still damp hair. In memory his first words sounded again. Canada is not worth it for me to invest a single cent in it. But now they sounded only like a shameful stain, like a reminder that arrogance once almost pushed him into the abyss. The whistle sounded again. Another freight train was departing. From this sound, Abdulaziz involuntarily clenched his fists. Through the noise, he said quietly so that only Omar and Sarah heard, "Tomorrow I will go with them. No longer as a guest, but as a teammate." Sarah rounded her eyes, wanted to object, but Omar put a hand on her shoulder and shook his head briefly. He understood. This man crossed into another world where power and money cannot replace faith and responsibility. Abdulaziz looked at the horizon where distant mountains turned blue in the sunlight. His eyes shone. This was not the arrogant look of a crown prince in gilded halls, but the look of a man who just found the true meaning to move on. And somewhere there on a dusty road, Isabel and her team continued their journey, carrying hope in small crates. She didn't know that behind her back a man, once so arrogant, silently put his honor and future at stake, choosing the same road she walked. The station buzzed, wheels knocked on rails, people pushed. Amidst all this, Abdulaziz closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This time in the air there was no smell of burning, suffocation. In it was the smell of damp earth, river wind, and warmth coming from the crowd. He smiled. A new smile that belonged not to a crown prince from the desert, but to a person who just found the most valuable treasure, faith in the Canadian soul.